All right, I think we're good to go. So hello again also to the ones that still joined. Welcome to this Linux webinar. Today we're going to talk about microservices, which I think is a really hot topic, very interesting, and we can share a lot of information from our own experience. But before we get started, just some information. You have the possibility to ask questions during the webinar. There should be a way to type your questions. I try to answer them as far as possible from a time perspective. Yes, and other than that, I think we would just get started. All right, so topic today is modernizing IT with microservices. So what do we actually want to cover today? In the first part, I'd like to talk about microservices in a bit more general way. So you should be able also, if you are fairly new to the topic, to understand what microservices are, what are their benefits, and then we segue a bit into the topic of how goes this together with enterprise architecture and what are some of the use cases, how you, many of you probably are working as an enterprise architect, can help to transform to microservice architecture and what's in it for you, basically. And yeah, thirdly, I'll show some nice use cases really in the tool. So in a live demo, we've built a nice little case where we show what you can do in terms of managing microservices in Linux. Okay, but first, a bit of motivation, so to say, to start. We did a study about microservices, and we asked over 100 IT experts, IT professionals, how they use microservices, what are their opinions about it, and how do they see to proceed it in the future. And I would love to share some insights, some high-level insights of this study with you. Yeah, you can download the study, the full study on our website on linux.net/downloads. So in case you want to have a deeper look. Yeah, maybe those results are not yet that surprising. So if we start looking at this, the smallest chunk, we use mostly microservices. So only 9% of the served companies are really maybe fully transformed to microservices, or maybe they ever used microservices because they're maybe a young company. But what's really interesting is a big chunk, like over 80%, they say they'll move to microservices at some point of time. So it's really on their radar. So it's really, it was a hot topic for a long time, but it seems now that it's really accelerating, that a lot of companies are tackling these challenges now. So you see only 20% say that currently it's not on their agenda. And maybe some additional information why microservices is really an interesting topic. When we studied the results from the survey, we found out that companies have obviously different release circles. So there are some that are more traditionally, so they only release perhaps maximum one per year. And then there are the really fast ones that deploy multiple times per week or even per day. And you see the large majority is still in this time frame, multiple times per year. So in rather long traditional release terms. If we now look into that deeper, then what's really interesting is that the number of releases with the ones that don't use microservices are much lesser than the ones that use microservices. So the companies that already have adopted microservices, at least to part, they are much faster to the market. So they have much shorter time to markets. So I think that's really one of the key benefits of moving to a microservice architecture. It allows you to really increase the speed your IT is delivering. And also adding to this that already today the microservices is on the agenda of companies. It's even going to intensify over the next year. So over 70% of companies said that they'll plan to intensify the usage of microservices. Well, like with all topics that are hot, there are a lot of challenges around that. So we also asked about the major hurdles of adopting microservices, and the top two are maybe not that surprising. Missing knowledge in people is the top reason why companies haven't adopted microservices or not adopting it faster, and also legacy processes. So like their old IT infrastructure, like also company processes, like team setups that make it really difficult to adapt to this new microservice architecture. And for exactly those 2 points, we want to show you what we can add to that, what you can add as an enterprise architect to that point. But maybe let's take one step back so that we are on the same page. I think you all will have a pretty good understanding of microservices, but let's just put all on the same level so that we basically can follow the discussion more easily later. On the left, we have a classic monolith structure. So you say like all functionality is in one big box. And if you scale it, you need to replicate the full box, so to say, maybe on multiple servers. Maybe, but you even would have to replicate one of the services. And that's exactly where microservices come in. They work differently. So every functionality, every small piece of functionality is put in a separate service. So you can like scale them by distributing these services, which has a lot of advantages. Like, for example, you just decouple the complexity, so to say. So you could have different teams work on different services. Like you can easily deploy a single service, and we'll talk about a couple of more later. Typical microservice architecture could look like this. So at the very bottom, you see you have the core services, and already one interesting and key concept of microservices as a best practice, all these different microservices, what is here called MS1, MS2, they have their own database, so they don't share databases, which again decouples complexity. Then if we move to the top, we have some composite services that bundle together functionality and finally offer different services via APIs. So you could call them those services and use them for business functionality. That like just the architecture on a very high level. We'll show some examples later. So this kind of architecture has 4 main advantages. The first one is because we are not as tightly coupled anymore in the architecture, we have like more loosely coupled services. It's not that bad if one service fails, so to say. So the failure tolerance is higher. The next one is, and there we touched on topics like DevOps, continuous integration. It's easier to deploy just a service than to deploy always a full monolith. So we gain speed by that. Also making us faster is how we can work with organizations with microservices. Like this it allows us for a more agile setup, because like teams, they are fully responsible for their service. They would develop it, deploy it all in one team, which again makes us faster. We don't need to throw over a release from development to operations. No, we can like fully be responsible for one service, which allows you to work more agile. And Lastly, flexible technology. With microservices, we are able to use different technologies in different microservices because they all talk to via APIs to each other. We don't need to, basically stick with a couple of technologies and forbid the others, so to say. No, we gain much more flexibility. Where benefits are, there also usually the challenges are not that far. So this, like decoupling more smaller services, obviously also bears some challenges. And one challenge is this high number of services itself. So we have a much higher complexity. And this is challenging because it's harder to understand dependencies. It's harder to integrate them maybe in a legacy software ecosystem. We have much more calls between services going on. It becomes increasingly difficult to identify certain spikes in communication, which can become a problem. And also, the information just increases dramatically because there are much more services teams need to know about. So we need to find a way to provide agile teams information about these services. With Linux, we've worked out solutions for that. So Linux is basically shared in three parts. The first one being the inventory. And this inventory really is the perfect vehicle to store your microservices information and be easily able to retrieve it. So you can just in a Google-like fashion search for a certain service, get updates about who is actually responsible, and all of this we have showed in the use case could be populated automatically. So you could connect your development environments with Linux and have always an automatic microservice overview in your EA tool, but still with the benefits of having all the other information around, like business capabilities and so on, and having a really nice user interface where you can search and do queries. The second is, if you model this, all the standard reports of Linux will work with it. So you can easily understand dependencies between microservices. You can trace data flows, all to get a better understanding how the services go together. And lastly, addressing these challenges of increased information need. So if you work with microservices, if you work with DevOps, your teams will have a higher demand for information. So it's really key that they get this information in an easy way. So they need to be able to look into that information themselves and collaborate. So we'll also show that in a couple of minutes. We can assign responsibilities, different roles. So it becomes much more easier to work together. Or if somebody starts new in a company, there will be one single place where all the information can be found. So let's jump over to some use cases. Today I'll talk about 5 different use cases. And the first one is I want to show a little how you can actually model microservices in an enterprise architecture manner, so to say, and how we do that in an automated way. Second is about dependency management. So I'll show an example of a shop system and how you can see how different services interact with each other on a single view. Third one is the roles we just talked about. Fourth one is it goes into metrics. So we monitor requests between microservices. And the fifth is how you as an enterprise architect can plan the roadmap towards a microservice architecture coming from a monolithic structure. So let's start with the first case, automated microservice repository. So what we've done is we have used the Linux Java SDK and wrote basically a small piece of code that connects to your development environment and allows to automatically populate the inventory in Linux with the information about new microservices. How does it work? After each deploy, this will be triggered. We will check if the microservice, the new microservice is already there or not. In case it's not there, it will be created, or in case it's already there, we will update it. So you see it's quite a simple JavaScript code. All further information could be found on dev.linux.net. So this is basically the segue from the development side of the deployment of the microservices towards the IT inventory. And that's where we jump now. Give me just 1 second. Then I switch to the browser here. All right. So as we have always also some people that don't know Linux yet, let me just give you a 2-minute overview. Promise it's not more, about what Linux is and what it does. So Linux is SaaS-based, so you see it runs in the browser, and it's a very lean and modern enterprise architecture tool. We have 3 main sections here. That's the new section. So here you would see all the changes that happen in the IT landscape since you last logged in, similar as you know it from LinkedIn or other social tools. Then here at the core, we have the inventory, where all the information, okay, so gonna re-log in. Well, let me just take this one. And here you see basically all the information that is stored. So it's like a structured way to store all information about the IT landscape, and we cluster it according to so-called fact sheets. So probably this model is familiar to you, like it's similar than many EA frameworks, starting at the top, more business capabilities, more the business side, going over the information side, where we have, for example, applications interfaces, and at the bottom, more the technology side, where we have stuff like IT component or the provider of the technology, and cluster information according to a technology stack. All this information you can easily retrieve by searching for it. You can filter it by using those facets here on the left. And you can do analysis when looking here at reporting. And that's also what I want to show you now. So I go to the visualizer, and I'd like to show you 2 models, how we've thought about modeling microservices in Linux. And I'll also will tell you a couple of words about what we believe who should use which model. So let's maybe start with the first one. Let's zoom that in a bit. So this first model, you see we have here the business part, we have applications, and then the microservices are modeled as IT components. So more like technology architecture. That's also seen because they are clustered in the technology stack. Second model, we model microservices really as applications. So that's why the clustering element is business capabilities. And you see IT components would be something below, so to say, like the platform of this single microservice. So what's the better model, or which model should you use, or what have we? What are our thoughts about that? We think for like many companies that start with a legacy IT that maybe are in a corporate environment, that's probably a model that's more suitable to begin with, because your applications or your stakeholders are used to applications that are a bit more abstracted, like a CRM system. And these systems, they'll show up, for example, in a business capability heat map. So it might not be helpful to have now suddenly the more technical microservices showing up in this kind of context. The downside is of doing it like this is what's really interesting for us is the connection between microservices. So how is data flowing? How are they connected to each other? Which APIs do we have? So we believe, in fact, that's kind of the more target model for us, because like then you have all the capabilities to visualize the relations between microservices and so on. So we would recommend to use this kind of model as a target, but looking at realities and also at companies we worked with, see that as a good model, that we have still the business focus more here and separate out the microservices. All right. So if we now have integrated this, we get these microservices automatically in. What does it allow us to do? One use case would be dependency management. So what I have done is I've modeled one microservice. So you can see it here. And yeah, it's actually, I hope you can see that well. It's actually an e-commerce shop system. It's creatively called shop. And below that, we have a couple of services. So you see now this shop, we have modeled it according to the second model, like where we have an application shop, and then all the microservices are IT components below that application. And this shop is now built out of different microservices. For example, we have a checkout service to do the checkout. We have a navigation service. We have a cart service. And then we have a database service below it. And below this database service, we have even like on a second hierarchy, like MongoDB and Redis. And that's basically what this database service is comprised of. And what can I now do? Like, you can now easily answer questions like, this database service, what dependencies does it have? To which services is there a dependency? So what happens if I want to replace this database service, or if you identify some problems with this database service, which microservices are, for example, affected? Or also the relation, if you update a service that has calls to other services, what are the implications? The nice thing about this visualization is once you have all this information in the inventory, you can easily pull it here in our visualizer report. So you could just search for service, and I find now, for example, this cart service. I can easily pull it in here and then create these drill downs, show the dependencies, and so on. So that's really one good use case for enterprise architects. I think one of the classic ones to make dependencies visible, to understand how things go together and how information flows. The next one is like really for agile teams. We said we need to be able to retrieve information easily. So I could, for example, now just start typing and want to retrieve the information about this card service. I click on it. So I see now that's the IT component card service. That's a fact sheet where all information is stored. And right now I'm just interested in responsibilities, in finding out contact persons. So we have different roles here. Like I would be, for example, the responsible product manager. We have our lead developer, and Roman would be responsible for test. So that's again, in a very easy way, you can retrieve information, you find responsibilities. If somebody leaves the company, you can easily update that. So you have always an up-to-date view on that. As an enterprise architect, one of your big roles in this whole transformation to microservices would be to plan the actual transformation. And you would do that normally with a roadmap, and that's what we also suggest. So I'll show the roadmap here and do a drill down to the related IT components. And if I filter now for a good time frame, then you see this kind of image, and it very nicely shows you that we have some legacy systems here, and this new microservice shop will replace them at some point, and it's comprised of multiple microservices. So the card service again, the checkout and so on, and you can easily understand how everything goes together. So how you break up this monolithic structure and break it down into microservices over time. So as a fifth use case, jumping back to my presentation, Linux has the possibility to put time series data in a context of enterprise architecture. So like on this charts, you see, for example, requests between microservices. This often can become a problem. There might be some microservices that are not built with best practices, so they call a lot of other microservices, which creates unnecessary dependency, which creates unnecessary network load. And if you can, with Linux, you can show these spikes in requests on a timeline, so you could easily see, well, we have a unusually high increase of requests here, so something must be wrong. So I check which microservices are responsible for this spike in requests. So that's also a use case, like to use the Linux Matrix add-on to show time series information about microservices and put it in a proper context in your EA repository to show it, for example, on an interface. All right. So before we close, I'd like to share some more information, best practices, what we learned when we actually transformed to microservices, because Linux itself also in the beginning had a more monolithic structure, and we cut it in several microservices. And we identified 5 major lessons that we learned along the way. So the first is really you need to get automation in place. So you need to use continuous integration, so you will need to be able to deploy really fast and in an automatic way. Otherwise, it's really not feasible to have a microservice architecture. Second one is keep the services at a reasonable size. So you might be tempted to introduce a lot of services, but we believe keep the number of services still smaller than your team size. That's what we identified as a rule of thumb. Third one is APIs should serve as primary interface, and they should be self-documented, like for example, like Swagger does, just to like keep the effort here in a minimal way. Fourth one is, microservices should be really independent, and one way to do this is that you don't share data storage for multiple microservices, so each microservices should have their own data storage. And the last one is, you really need to be able to scale security. That's why you need to have a distributed verification, for example, like OAuth 2. If you have more questions about that, like how we did that, how we learned that, just reach out and we're happy to share some more insights there. Okay, so we approached the half-hour mark, so I'd like to wrap up slowly. So to get you started, what you can do is still today, like even today, because even that we approach the evening in Europe, you can get our full Linux study. It's on linux.net downloads. Have a look and just see what you can get out for you, like how this applies to your company, how this gets you thinking about microservices. Then, like in the very more short term, I would recommend to really, look what stakeholders you need to get involved to drive a microservice transformation, and then just start with a small pilot. Try to solve maybe a new project or a smaller project with microservices. And after that, I think you as enterprise architects are really well positioned to be a driver in this transformation. So you should really look to maybe kick off larger transformation projects and make it a priority also for your own agenda. That's it for today. Thanks very much for dialing in today. You can get in touch with us. You can write me an email. We'll also follow up to share the recording of this session. And in case you have any questions or want to also see Linux live in action for your own challenges, just please reach out to me. My email is simon.barth, B-A-R-T-H, @linux.net. Have a good day for the ones out of America, and have a good evening for the European ones. And I hope to see or hear you soon. Bye.